Michael McGill, and really pleased to be part of this, whatever we're on here, webcast. And just a quick self-introduction. I've been a school person for more years than I like to think about. I was most recently superintendent of schools in Scarsdale, New York, there for 16 years. Scarsdale, if you don't know it, is traditionally a very high-performing district located just outside New York City. The backstory is that my father was a school superintendent before me, so I went into the family business. And also I was a college graduate in the 1960s. So of course, that was a time where everybody wanted to change the world. And I thought, well, what better way to do it than education? Well, Race to the Bottom, which is the title of the book, was something I wrote after, again, probably too many years in education. And is really an attempt to think about how we got to where we are, or where we were in education in the late 1900s and early 2000s. And while it's about a lot of different pieces of that journey, one of the main themes is how the school reform movements of the 1990s and 2000s, particularly the emphasis on high stakes testing and accountability, instead of achieving what their authors, we hope, intended, tended to drive schools and the quality of education to a low average. And the book is called Race to the Bottom because not only were we doing that if we just consider education in the United States, we were also driving education downwards relative to what was going on in the global context, where a number of other nations were making very concerted efforts to shift the kind of teaching and the kind of curriculum that they provided kids to emphasize critical thinking, creative thinking, problem solving, those kinds of much more high order skills than the sort of test-driven instruction that we were doing here in the States. Well, continuing the previous thought, what we did in the United States over a period of 30 to 40 years was to develop and to rely on a literal handful of interventions to reform what was thought of as the system, or as one former commissioner of Educator, head of the Department of Education in Washington, no longer the commissioner, now the secretary, called the blob, as if this were one single system instead of what it is, a very complex array of institutions that are sometimes connected and sometimes semi-coupled and sometimes independent of one another. And I guess the second and third issues I'd mention would be that there's tremendous social inequity in our country, and the effects of that inequity have a big impact on the kind of learning that occurs in schools and what kids are able to do and what teachers and the schools more broadly are able to do with them. And that inequity can be partially addressed by dedicated teaching and by what schools can do alone. But until we commit the kind of resourcing to offsetting those deficits, we're really destined for a future of quite unequal outcomes. And then the third piece that I'd mention is quality of teaching, which in some schools and in some places is really excellent, but in many places is not. And turns out that the variability in teaching quality is something we see not only at a sort of a national level from state to state or from district to district, but is also something that we see within districts and within schools. It's been noted that often the variability from one classroom to the next in any given school is at least as great, if not greater than that occurs from one school to another or from one district to another? Well, there are a lot of pieces to the answer to that question, and you could try to respond from the standpoint of what can the federal government do or what can state governments do. But just for right now, let me just talk about the school and district level, which is what I know best. And the context against which I'm going to make 2 or 3 suggestions is really that many elements of that kind of education already exist. Again, it's consistent with the idea of tremendous variability. The problem, again, is that even within a single school, you can find really terrific things going on and kids very engaged in one classroom, and you walk next door and you find kids tuned out, not interested in what's going on in class. And so a big issue is trying to find ways to make the quality of curriculum, instruction, and so on more consistent and more effective, and to really raise the level rather than pitch it to a lower common denominator, which is what we've been doing. So let me just tick off 2 or 3 possible areas for focus. One has to do with the aims of teaching and learning to begin with. What are we trying to achieve with our curriculum? And historically, what we've done is to create curriculums that are what the education innovator Ted Sizer called an inch deep, but a mile wide. So trying to cover huge amounts of information, material, and oftentimes in areas that really don't have a lot to do with academics to begin with. So a first thing I think we should be focusing on is to define a really meaningful core of ideas and skills and dispositions, like tenacity or an interest in going deeper into a subject, and to structure curriculums so that they focus on that much narrower range of knowledge and capacities. Second thing I'd mention would be finding ways to personalize education more. In the 19th century, there was at that time a well-known image of the ideal college being a great teacher on one end of a log and a student on the other end. And the same is true, I think, of schools, that what goes on in that encounter between the teacher who is able to get to know the student and get to know how the student thinks, and a student who can respond to the teacher's thinking and questioning. That image is a very powerful image, and it's one that we should be striving to realize in schools today. And we'll get to talking about technology in a few minutes probably, but one of the great promises of technology is that if properly used, it may help us to come closer to that ideal. I guess the third thing I'd say is that we as people tend to get more engaged, more involved when we see what we're learning as connected to other things that have meaning. So finding connections between what we're being asked to apprehend and other ideas or the real world. And we also tend to become more engaged when we have agency, when we're active learners, when we're when we're actively inquiring. And so I'll give you an example of a educational experience, I guess, that realizes both of those principles. So one of the things I talk about in the book is a student-initiated research project that took place in one fifth grade class that I followed for quite a while. And so the project involved all kids in the class identifying a question that was of interest to them and formulating an essential question or questions with the cooperation of the teacher, one that really required a kind of in-depth inquiry, and then doing the follow-up research, writing a paper, producing a video based on the research. So this one boy had been talking with his mother about the film Flags of Our Fathers, which now is a bunch of years ago, but basically the story of the assault on Iwo Jima. And the boy got very interested in the movie and went to his teacher and talked to the teacher about it. And together they worked on an essential question. And the question was, what was the Battle of Iwo Jima? But more important, why was it important? So the student began his research and doing a lot of work online, eventually ended up contacting a Marine veteran who lived in New Orleans. And the veteran shared his own experiences, ended up sending the boy pictures of the assault, the landing craft, and finally ended up sending him a bottle full of black sand from the beach. So the boy completed the research project, including the video in which he, at the very end, he holds up the bottle of sand. And it's just this incredibly powerful moment in which it's very clear that this was an important learning experience about an important subject that really changed the way this young man looked at the world. And that's the kind of experience, I think, that we want for all of our kids. It's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that's actually very promising about it is that we've actually learned a lot about how to work with people who have diverse learning styles, diverse learning needs. When I was first teaching back in the late 60s, basically it was something that was a topic that I learned practically nothing about as a teacher. And even people who were specialists in special education or in teaching different learning styles had a much less sophisticated body of knowledge to work with. Over the way too many years since then, we've come to learn just a lot more. And again, the problem is now not so much lack of knowledge, although there's God help us, always more to be learned, as it is implementation. We've learned, for example, about building on students' strengths rather than teaching to their deficits or trying to help people overcome their deficits all the time. And we've learned to do that, among other things, by just using a much wider variety of teaching approaches and strategies. And technology has been a big boon in the process of doing that. It really does allow teachers to do a much more sophisticated job of drawing on outside resources and also of reinforcing skills and learning more about how kids think. So if we can, or to the degree that we can do a better job of disseminating techniques that are have been proven to be effective, we're going to do an increasingly good job of working with kids with a range of needs and a range of abilities. Well, we've been, for the last several months here, we've been involved in sort of an unwilling experiment in a different kind of education. And I think the question is, what have we learned from the experience, and what do we know now that we didn't know to begin with? And some of the things I guess we've learned have been bit of a dose of cold water on those who have believed that the future of the classroom is really completely online, and that face-to-face contact really isn't going to be that critical. I can remember years ago hearing a futurist talk about the importance of online learning, and not only that, but there will be some day where we will all be sitting around with little speakers in our ears with a artificial intelligence tutor talking to us about what it is that we should be learning, and then we would be online all the time doing whatever it was that the voice told us, which I always found sort of a dystopian and slightly terrifying concept. But at any rate, that was one concept. Well, I think one of the things we found out is that kids need other kids, and kids need adults to work directly with them. So there's a sort of a social setting or a social benefit to being with other people in a class. And there's also a benefit that you get from working directly with a teacher. Some researchers have found that at least 40% of the kids who've been involved in the great experiment over the last few months have really been pretty much unengaged. And the lack of engagement has been worse, actually, in communities where kids are disadvantaged or where there are learning problems. So to start with, student-adult contact seems to be very important to engagement of kids who we at Edge are often most concerned about. Second, I guess a lot of parents have learned that their capacity for homeschooling is somewhat limited too. So my guess is that over the next however many months or years, we're still going to have school buildings, and we're still going to have kids in them, and we're still going to have teachers working with them. Maybe sometime down the line, after you and I are not around and don't have to worry about this stuff anymore, it'll be different. But at least for the foreseeable future, I think schools are going to be schools. The question of what goes on in those schools and how much can go on outside of it, though, is really an important and interesting and potentially very exciting. One of the things we know about teaching and technology up until now has been that many teachers have gotten very engaged in using personal devices and other technology, but a lot of people haven't. It's been kind of if you wanted to, you could, and your district might encourage you to. But if you really didn't want to, you could figure out ways not to, and to rely on what you knew and what you did well. What this last several weeks and months has done for us is to engage a large number of people in working with technology tools that probably they didn't use before, or that they didn't use particularly effectively before. And to the extent that going forward, we can build on that base to use technology to extend the classroom, to humanize the encounter between teacher and student, we're really going to be better off because of all that we've gone through.